Mark Pigot, KB, professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences. Roland Greene's work, as the website says, concerns, quote, with the early modern literatures of England, Latin Europe and the transatlantic world, and with poetry and poetics from the Renaissance to the present, unquote. Among other accomplishments, Professor Greene's contribution as editor-in-chief of the monumental work, the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, speaks volumes for his extraordinary commitment to literature as an intellectual and philosophical exploration of the world. And from my own discussion with students who have been using two words to define Professor Greene, one is that he's a very modest man, and another is that he's very accommodative. But when we look at the scope of his work, it is staggering and breathtaking. I mean, the sheer magnitude of it. And therefore, my first question is, for a teacher and researcher whose work essentially spans the entire world, what is the distinction you would make between poetry and poetics?
Well, I think of poetry as informed by poetics. I think of poetics as the science of how poetry is made, how poetry is understood. So I see myself as practicing poetics, not poetry. And I see my work as trying to put poetry and poetics into dialogue with each other. I always think of poetics as the science of poetry that goes back to Aristotle and is a long and proud tradition of scholars since that time who in many traditions and across many centuries have developed a set of principles for how poetry works, a kind of lively conversation about the nature of how poems resonate in their societies and how they affect readers, and all the things that poems do are captured by poetics in a theoretical spirit.
But the word poetics, I mean, there are books like The Poetics of Imperialism, The Poetics of Space, The Poetics of Time.
Right.
And in that sense, is it still poetry that we are talking about in all those usages?
Yeah, no, it's not. That's not poetics. That's a kind of figurative use of poetics that people in our field indulge in from time to time when they're trying to say something. They're trying to make a certain kind of claim for what they're doing. But I actually think I follow a stricter view of poetics in terms of the intellectual genealogy of the field and the sense that it is about poetry and what makes poetry and the nature of the poetic more than anything else. So it's an interesting question because I have sometimes heard that. Going back many years, I've had people say to me, but poetics is invoked in so many different situations where people are working on anything in our field. You can say it's the poetics of something. I take a stricter view than that.
Can you tell us something about your experience as editor-in-chief of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics?
It was an enormous undertaking. It took us about 6 years. We started working on it in 2006, myself and a team of editors. And it appeared in 2012. It involved, of course, this is a book that has been through several editions. Ours was the fourth edition. So we were building on a very distinguished base of the previous editions, including a number of articles that existed and were in good shape and simply had to be updated in some fashion. We also added an enormous number of articles. As the book came out 5 years ago, so I've sort of started to forget some of the details. If you'd asked me this 5 years ago, I could have told you exactly, but we had, I think we had about 700 contributors, of whom about 400 were living, and there are 1,100 entries in the book. And the real challenge was, in a book of that size, it is 1.6 million words, we agreed from the beginning of the project that the book could not get any longer than it had been in the past. So we had to rebuild it within the size of the previous edition, the third edition of 1993, without expanding anything. The real challenge was to find a way to accommodate all of the global. One of our priorities was to make it a much more globally aware book. And we felt that so much has happened in the field of poetics since the early 90s, all around the world, that we wanted a way of reflecting that in the encyclopedia. So I'll give you an example that might be of local interest. In the 1993 book, there were a couple of articles on India and Indian poetics, sort of omnibus entries by people that sort of took a view of the whole country and sort of discussed broad trends. And we thought that that was not sufficient for this edition. So for India alone, we created, if I remember correctly, 17 new entries on the various languages and traditions, which, as you know very well, many of which are longer than those in the West, and found experts in each of them. Of course, the trick about this is you have to find not only the expert, but you have to find somebody to read it for you so that it's peer-reviewed. So we had to find people in every one of these traditions who could write the entry and somebody else who could review them for us. And we did that we did that all over the world. So we did the same thing with Latin America. In 1993, the Latin American section was an omnibus entry on the poetry of Spanish America and an entry on Brazil. And we added at least a dozen new entries on most of the countries in Latin America, which, as you know, some of them, like Chile, have had multiple Nobel Prize winning poets. A wonderful, enormous article on the poetry of the indigenous Americas, which had never been in the book before. So the challenge was, how do you add all of that without making the book any longer? And I'll tell you, we did it by taking words away from certain big articles having to do with the poetry of the United States, poetry of some of the countries of Europe, and moving those words into these more global entries. It was quite a challenge.
Because I looked at it, it's unbelievable, to even think about something of that kind of, that dimension. I think it's really very, somehow it defies the imagination, at least for me.
It was.
Because I was looking at those articles, it's almost everything under the sun is.
It is almost everything under the sun. We were thinking, when we were halfway through it, we thought, as far as we can tell, this is everything under the sun. We asked a lot of people for advice. And there are situations in which we would discover late in the game that we were missing an article on something, where we would suddenly realize that there was some phenomenon in the world of poetry that we had missed. One day I was driving home from work and listening to the radio, and they said that the National Endowment for the Arts, which in the U.S. is a major agency that gives money for artistic productions of various kinds, that agency spends an enormous amount of money supporting cowboy poetry in the United States. Poetry in rural areas that takes a kind of cowboy perspective. And I didn't know that cowboy poetry existed. And then when I got to the office the next day, I said, we need an entry on cowboy poetry. And so very late in the game, I found a wonderful author who actually specializes in cowboy poetry. And I said, can you give us an article fairly quickly? And she did. And that happened again and again as we kept discovering new things that had somehow eluded the editors of the previous editions and also eluded us when we were making our plans. So it went down to the end with our continuing to try to expand the scope, and it was a challenge. I'm glad I did it, and I think it is a monument. I think you're right.
I have a couple of questions along those lines. Actually, one is a personal one, and other is a more general one. One is how inclusive even something of that magnitude is of work happening in dialects outside the domain of material available in translation. Mm-hmm. For instance, one of my favorite examples is Barbara Stoller-Miller, who I think is just a phenomenon in herself.
Right.
And so are her translations of, and her understanding of the Sanskrit literary traditions. Mm-hmm. But it is still a tradition operating at a macro level.
That's right.
And because nobody speaks or writes in Sanskrit.
Right.
So to what extent you think that an encyclopedia of this kind can look at work being done in those dialects?
I think that is really a challenge for an encyclopedia like this to accommodate that kind of work. And especially to do justice to the enormous enterprise of translation that's going on in either classical languages that no longer have a vernacular presence, or regional or local languages or dialects of languages, and the translations in those areas that are sometimes very lively and very, they're the translations like Barbara Stoler Miller. Those are enormous contributions to world literature.
Yeah.
And it's hard for us, in a book like that, to deal with translation adequately. I mean, there is a big article on the entire phenomenon of translation, but what we tried to do, I'm trying to think of a good example of one way we tried to address this, was to make a point of listing in the bibliography of many entries the really notable translations of the works in that language, and how, we were always mindful that we were trying to send students and prospective students to the best that they could find in a given field, and we often tried to include a list of really indispensable translations that students would want to go to. So if it's an article on Sanskrit, there would be a section in the bibliography on that. And we tried to do that for many entries. Part of this was it was a matter of telling our contributors, we want to have a serious presence of translation in the bibliographies. And some of them were more receptive to it than others. Some traditions are more robust in that area than others. So we tried to even it out and keep it pretty consistent across the book.
The personal question is it's accommodative, something that, in some ways is a reflection of your own personality, But my point is, what is the idea behind being accommodative? Should we really be accommodative of as many traditions as possible, or somewhere should we be selective?
In what context?
In the context of the encyclopedia.
I see, yeah. Well, when the book first came out, there were a couple of reviewers that said that the book had bent over backwards. And especially, we made an editorial decision early on in the process that we wanted to decentralize the book. And instead of having, for instance, in American literature, instead of having only an enormous article on American literature, American poetry, that would somewhere along the way mention beat poetry, transcendental poetry, the New York School, the San Francisco Renaissance, we decided that we wanted to break those pieces out and have, obviously as well as I, there are specialists on every one of those things who are more than ready to write an entry on them. And so this is one of the ways we saved some words, was by shrinking the big omnibus articles on something like American poetry and sending specialist contributors off to write local pieces on smaller phenomena, so that the experience of reading the book would be, we wanted to make it sort of a paradise for browsers, so that as you'd go through the book, instead of you open it up and instead of encountering a 60-page article on American poetry and trying to find your way through it, you'd find a shorter article on American poetry, and then you'd keep finding smaller articles on a lot of different phenomena. So when we were contracting with the contributors for all the international poetry articles, we said, are there avant-garde movements, schools of poetry, styles of poetry, and specialized technical terms in your area that we should have a discrete article about, and could you recommend a specialist who could write that piece? That means that the book, as you page through it, it feels as though you're constantly coming across the local texture of poetry all over the world. You are constantly encountering small articles that will fill you in on a term or on a movement, and that is really a sea change from what it was a generation ago, when many of the articles were these big, painted on a very big canvas and telling a very broad story. I don't think you can be too accommodating for that. I think the project in its nature, and from the first edition in 1965, has had the ambition of being a worldwide encyclopedia of poetry, and our mandate was not to change that. It was to do the best job with that mission that we could possibly do in the year 2012. And so we thought that the way to go was to expand it, to expand the scope, bring many more voices into it, bring a younger generation of scholars into it, turn to the people that had really, around the world, people that have really risen to prominence or are about to rise to prominence in the broad field of poetics since the 90s. And when you're doing that and you're trying to give voice to a new generation of scholars, you're trying to create a book with a lot of texture, you're trying to decentralize the perspective of the book somewhat, then I think it's a matter of being accommodating is indispensable. I think that's the only way to realize the vision of the book that we had from the beginning and that the press wanted us to maintain.
No, personally, I think, I am aware of the democratic spirit behind the whole project, but universality has come under some criticism, and even the whole politics of accommodation. Fortunately or unfortunately, has become the subject of debate. Mm-hmm. But of course, I wouldn't like to place a book of this kind under that kind of discussion.
Well, I would say there's nothing universalist about having this kind of diversity in the book. On the contrary, this enables us to demonstrate how much specificity and how much difference there is in poetries around the world. It's much easier to maintain a universalist account of poetry when you have a relative few people, writing a relative few articles, and for instance, one person writing on the poetry of Spanish America in a big omnibus article. That entry is much more likely to be based on a universalist assumption about Latin American poetry than having 15 main entries based on the national literatures, and then probably another 20 entries based on smaller phenomena. What you get is a much deeper sense of the differences that exist in poetry and poetics around the world by having that kind of book that's been decentralized and devolved, so to speak, into the parts of the phenomenon.
I want our audience to know what would be the underlying theme or set of themes that dominates your work as a whole?
Well, I think most of what I do is involved with recovering the past, the poetry, especially the poetry, but more broadly the literature of the past. And I am, sometimes it's the distant past, 400 or 500 years ago, and sometimes it's the near past, because I also work on poetry and poetics in the 20th and 21st centuries. I think of it as, I'm not a chronicler of the present, so I don't do what some friends of mine do who are poetry scholars who are always writing about the new thing, the latest thing. I tend not to do that, and that's just a temperamental thing. I tend to think of my work as being a project of recovering the past and trying to identify the contexts, the worldviews, the states of mind that enable people in the present to understand how literature functioned in society and in people's lives in the past. And for me, sometimes that involves assembling a completely historical context around that. I've done some work where I really am a historicist and I'm trying to create a historicist narrative that helps people to understand the past and brings in context from history and politics and other disciplines. But sometimes it really involves what I think of as a kind of theoretical approach to the literature of the past, in which I propose a few terms by which we might undertake the mental exercise of looking at the past in a different way than we might expect. And so it's not always historicist, it's not always historical, it's sometimes, I would say, imaginative. And I spend a lot of time thinking about, in all of my projects, how to achieve that kind of connection between past and present for a reader. What it would take for a modern person to understand how people in the 16th century understood the term world, for instance, and how you might construct an account, and how you might assemble the evidence, how you might organize the argument in such a way that people can have a chance of understanding that in the way that I think early modern people did. What I don't do generally is just write the kind of criticism where you simply lay out the evidence the way every other academic book does and assume that everybody understands it. I spend a lot of time thinking about the specific needs of each project, and that's in why, in a way, my books don't resemble each other. They're all different. They are a little bit like children that look like they came from different parents. You know, they're all different, and they involve very specific choices that are unique to each project, for better or worse.
Very true, very true. Blood, invention, language, resistance, world, and I mean, I looked at your book, and these are words that are very popular with the subaltern masses in the third world. They're constantly using these words because they come to us as part and parcel of the legacy of humanism.
Absolutely.
But I mean, needless to say, they come from a European Western background. So, can you throw some light on, I mean, why these specific words you think are so important?
Well, when I undertook this project called 5 Words, I started it well over 10 years ago, because it took me nearly 10 years to write it. It came out in 2013. I wanted to write about, you know, in the same vein in which I said I like to write about the past in a way that presents it to present day people in a way that they can understand. I wanted to choose words that were not keywords in the sense in which in our field that's a familiar term. Keywords are the kind of words that the great English scholar Raymond Williams wrote about, in where you can get at the nature of a century or a moment by examining big important words that carry a lot of cultural weight, like nature or culture. Education. And those words are fine, and Williams did an exemplary job of that kind of project, as have a number of other people since then. But when I was undertaking this project, I thought I wanted words that were more like everyday words, words that would somehow tell the story of the period, but that where going into the project, I wouldn't know exactly what the story was going to be. If you said to a person in my field, write about a word like sovereignty in the Renaissance, I tend to think that most competent people in the field would be able to write something like that, and we would all probably agree about much of what was written there. At least that's my bias in thinking that keywords have a kind of inevitability to them. And I wanted words that were not inevitable. I wanted words that were a surprise. So when I went into the project, I was thinking very much about the phenomenon of constraint in literature. I had been reading a lot of the French avant-garde movement, the Oulipo movement, that since the 1960s has been writing poetry governed by very strict rules of constraint. And I wanted to put constraints on this project. And I thought the first constraint would be 5 words that felt like randomly chosen words, where you could not see a connection between them and you could not imagine what story they would tell. And I thought, I want to put them side by side and then follow each one and see if at the end of the story that I assembled, you had reached to the heart of the period. And what I didn't really envision was that it really is like writing 5 different books, because the 5 words are so different. The literature about them is so different, and the scholarly literature about them is so different, that it really was like 5 discrete projects.
The approach is unique, because the idea of using words to create an entire history, like the word human, for example.
Exactly.
I mean, its power, especially in the third world, is
is
so great. Its radical potential is so great.
But I really wanted to show that you're absolutely right that these words, the words I chose, blood, invention, language, resistance, and world, are words that, even if they seem a little randomly chosen, they do carry an enormous power around the world, and especially in those parts of the world that were shaped by humanism in the form of imperialism. Those words come loaded. And I wanted to write a book that, without ever making that connection explicitly, would be the prehistory of those words as they were in the past, so that people in the present would understand why they have so much power. And so it was in the back of my mind throughout the project that this book could potentially be useful to people in later fields, could potentially be useful to people working on not only modernism but post-colonial and contemporary literature. And I thought if I did it right, it would open it would be like a key opening a door to a long history, a long semantic history that would make modern readers say, oh, I understand now something of why that word has this kind of inchoate power in our culture. And so that was in my mind, that it would be useful to people in other fields. And it was certainly written in the spirit of trying to communicate to people in other fields. It was not written as an insider's kind of book for people in my immediate field of Renaissance literature. It was meant to speak more broadly.
To a general audience.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
That more often than not, it made me reflect on other words, so many other words.
Well, that was the point, what I thought was if I handle this the right way, my ideal reader, the next time he or she opens a work of literature, that they would start to think, well, what if you told the story of every word this way? What if you devoted this amount of attention to a lot of other everyday words that we encounter in literature, where our inclination as modern people is to imagine that because an older writer uses the same word that we use, that it's the same word that we use now. That in other words, there's a kind of untroubled continuity between the vocabulary of the past and of the present. And what I show in those chapters is that the word blood, although we still use the same word, means something radically different in the 15th and 16th century than it does now. It still refers to the substance in a human body, but the understanding of how it works is radically different from what it is now. Same thing with world, same thing with the others. And I wanted to raise the awareness of readers that perhaps every word deserves that kind of treatment. Perhaps, and since I can't do every word even on a page, I thought 5 words would be enough to demonstrate the potential of that kind of reading and to model different kinds of stories that words could tell. 5 I thought was enough to have enough diversity among them that you would start to see that they operate differently from each other, and that there's a kind of range of readings that one could bring to bear on the words of the past.